and antlers will dramatically bias what people will estimate a deer. So I tell people, cover the antlers, look at the body characteristics, and then if you absolutely cannot decide between two ages, go ahead and use the antlers to help break that tie, but do not use the antlers to age it.
All right, what is up, everybody? I've got Jim to my right, and at press time, as I like to say, it's January. It's cold. Jim and I are just coming off a coyote hunt where we hunted in at -18, Jim. A bit of a cold snap.
Just a bit.
And keeping that in mind, what is on our mind right now is deer. Because deer, at least for me, Jim, they're always on my mind.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's not really a timely thing. It's just an all-the-time thing.
Yeah. Which I think for any healthy person, that's how their brain should work. So across from us, we've got Kip Adams from the National Deer Association. Kip, welcome.
Hey, thanks, guys. And tell you, it was only -9 at my house this morning, so I feel a little weak now, or like a wimp, given the temperatures you guys are dealing with.
No, I don't think you're a wimp at all. I just think that means it's time to pour up a margarita, throw on the swim trunks, fill up the kiddie pool outside, and go take a dip.
Exactly. Very tropical. -9, very tropical. Kip, if you can, tell us a little bit about yourself and introduce yourself, and a little bit about the National Deer Association to give people a little bit of structure and framework of where you guys are coming from.
Sure. I'm in northern Pennsylvania. I'm the chief conservation officer for the National Deer Association, so which means I'm a wildlife biologist, work with deer hunters, and deer management professionals across the United States and Canada. So I call Pennsylvania home, but I work in 20 to 25 different states a year.
Oh, wow.
I'm teaching people about deer and how to enhance habitat, how to manage deer. I have a great job. At the NDA is our mission is to ensure the future of wild deer, wildlife habitat, and hunting. So we get to work with a range of people who work with or impact whitetails, mule deer, actually all deer species. So we have a lot of fun, helping people learn a little more about how deer see, how deer hear, how they navigate a landscape, what they eat, movement patterns. We teach people how to get closer to them in the fall, how to be able to get better pictures during the year, and ultimately, though, just to make sure that we have healthy deer out there, and we have opportunities to be able to go chase them around and hopefully put a few in the freezer each year.
So everything deer.
I like that.
I do like that because it's one of my favorite topics. Now, because you guys do so much in the deer arena, we're gonna narrow our focus today a little bit and talk about something that I find super interesting, super fascinating. I think people talk a lot about, I guess, when you're talking deer, when you're talking, quotation mark management, when you're talking healthy populations, and that's kind of like the age.
Yes.
Age structure, healthy structures with multiple age classes of animals and things like that. People are like, oh, that's a 1.5-year-old, that's a 2.5, that's a 3.5. I'm trying to get these bucks to 4. If you are managing a property, things of that nature. But how do you know? How do you, what are the indicators, both on the hoof and I guess, post-mortem for a person to either speculate the age of a deer or find out afterwards, like, hey, I got him. I wonder how truly old this deer is.
Mm-hmm.
Kip, we're hoping you can shed some light on this.
Absolutely. This is a good subject, and I have a deep interest in this. There's a couple different ways you can do that, and the best way is to actually have that jawbone in your hand. If it's a deer that you shot, you can get that jawbone out, and based on either the tooth eruption patterns or the amount of wear that's on that jaw, you can very accurately estimate how old that deer is. So if it's after you shot a deer, I can walk you through the process and very accurately estimate age. Fortunately, though, we can also estimate age of that deer on the hoof when it's still alive. Not so much for the does, but absolutely for the bucks. And there's body characteristic changes that they go through as they age, very similar to humans in many cases, that we can use to predict how old that deer is. That's not as accurate as using the jawbone, but still can get a really good idea for the vast majority of the deer on how old they are. So I'm game if you guys are. You let me know which of those you'd like to start with, and we can talk about how folks can use those.
Why don't we go kind of in, I guess, the order of operations that it might occur for a hunter, and we'll start with looking at them while they're alive. Maybe you got some trail cam pics. Maybe you're actively scouting. Maybe you're doing some summer scouting, or you're hunting in the fall and trying to determine like, hey, particularly I guess on the bucks, because Jim, I mean that's what matters, right? But I mean with the ones with the antlers. Just kidding, folks. But yeah, let's maybe walk us through some of those visual indicators, body characteristics that a person might be able to judge that. And I've got, I guess, a host of questions to go along with that, as far as like how maybe some of those characteristics change throughout the year, right? As far as like, a summer buck's going to look a little bit different than, a buck in November or something like that. So, but yeah, let's start with those deer that are walking around and we're still actively pursuing them.
Sounds good. And you know what? I'm actually going to start with the fawns. Now, we're not misidentifying buck fawns as an older buck, but I'm going to start with this because it's a great way to differentiate buck fawns from doe fawns or from adult does. People can then target adult does, put more meat in the freezer, or pass on those buck fawns and allow them to reach that 1.5-year-old age class where they get their first set of antlers. So something that's very simple for hunters to be able to watch in the field is that all fawns have a short head. And what that means is if you look at a deer from the side, all you can see is its head. On a fawn, buck or doe fawn, the eye is about halfway between the top of the head and the nose. So if you look at it, from the side, see where the head is, see where the nose is, that eye is about dead in the middle on a fawn. On an adult doe, that eye is closer to the top of the head than it is the nose. So what that means is if you take an adult doe, that distance, cut it right in half, you are not cutting through the eye like you would on a fawn, because it's almost always longer from the eye to the nose than it is from the eye to the top of the head. So if you see an antlerless deer and all you see is the head from the side, you can very quickly and accurately estimate, is this likely a fawn or a doe that's at least 1.5 years old? So that's our first thing we're going to look at. Now, if you have the chance to see that head straight on, now we really can estimate what it is, because all does have a rounded head. So between the ears, they're very rounded. All bucks have a very flat head. So even a buck fawn whose little pedicles haven't necessarily popped out yet, if you look at them, whether this is a deer in the field, you can look at pictures of deer on TV, anything. You look at a buck fawn's, his head is very flat between the ears. This is really evident in summer coat. It's a little more difficult to tell once they get into the winter coat because it's so long and thick. But even then, if that head is very flat between the ears, it's a buck. If that is rounded, it is a doe. Every single time. That is a really, really good way to differentiate between the two.
No, I was just going to say I've been around a lot of deer, and that's not an observation. Like, I'm kind of like looking back, and I'm like, golly, I guess you are right. Thinking about the bucks, but it's never something that I would have put two and two together.
Yeah.
Oh. The last way that we can easily identify fawns versus adults is taking a look at the body of the animal. And if you look between the legs, an adult doe, the part between the front legs and the back legs is much more like a rectangle shape. That same distance between the front legs and back legs on a fawn is much more of a square. Some people refer to it as a doe looks like a suitcase between the legs. A fawn looks like a briefcase. So if all you see is a deer, okay, I can tell it's antlerless. I can't see the head real good, but I can see the body. You very quickly will know, is this likely an adult or likely a fawn of the year? So one of those three things that I just said in almost every case can make it very easy to pick fawn versus deer that's at least 1.5 years old.
Yeah, and I mean, that's all super valuable to know if you're trying to make that determination, because like you said, you might not be able to see the head. Maybe the head is behind some brush, but you can see, the way those legs lay out, or maybe you can't see that, but you can see the head and see where that eye position is, or maybe it's like you said, it's facing you and they're looking right at you, and you can see that rounded or flat head. I'm a better fawn gauger now, Jim.
How about that, Mark?
I'm not going to have any excuses anymore when I shoot that button buck.
That's right.
And early in the year, there's the best size difference between, does and those fawns. But once we get late into the hunting season, particularly for northern deer, a lot of those buck fawns can be just about as large, as a 1.5-year-old doe, if they have. So sometimes those you can't just tell based on body size. But those characteristics I just gave you, even if a buck fawn is about the same size as a 1.5-year-old doe, what we just discussed will help you differentiate between the two, regardless of how big that buck fawn is.
Yeah, that is one thing I've been noticing a lot driving around. I feel like, especially now that we're getting into shed season, you start seeing deer running around where you're like, man, I wonder if that's a doe or if that is a buck that maybe shed or whatever. And or it is a younger buck that's just big, whatever it is, and gonna have to use some of these tricks here.
Yeah, or
I'll try not to get too distracted using them and crash, but yeah,
not easy. I may have been doing some shedding while driving yesterday, Jim. I don't know. There's just so many tracks in the snow.
You were shedding like antlers, like?
Well, no, but I was like observing high areas of deer traffic in the snow. The deer weren't present, but I was like, oh, maybe you'll find a road shed. Go knock on the door and say, hey, mind if I pick that up? I didn't find any though, and I also didn't crash off the road. So, definitely some positives there.
The wins in the right places, loss. Anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Man, super, super interesting there. So what about what about other body characteristics when, or getting back to the bucks and how they age out?
So like now you're for sure it's a buck. Like that. Now You're just trying to figure out, is it a 1.5, 2.5, 3.5, 4.5 kind of there?
Yeah, or also, Kip, if you weren't done there, keep rolling, because that was all fantastic information.
Now, I think we've closed out on the fawn, so let's say, okay, we can see antlers. It's definitely a buck. Let's estimate how old he is. And with this one, I'll have to lay down some qualifications first. One is that this is not an exact science. So aging on the hoof, once you get to 1.5, is not proven in science to be exact by age class, but there are very definite changes that bucks do as they grow to make us be able to pretty accurately estimate age, particularly within a year of the true age. And it is best to do this during the rut. The reason for that is because we have the greatest changes in those body characteristics that we're looking at that time of the year. Summer bucks are the most difficult to age because, testosterone levels are very low. You just don't have the changes that you're going to see in the course of, 2 to 3 months down the road. So you can estimate best right at or about the rut. It's best to get a side view of these deer to get the best look at the body characteristics that we're going to use to differentiate. And if you're in the field, you can't always get that. But if you have pictures that you're looking at, you're trying to estimate age, definitely look at it from straight on. So not looking down at them or up at them, but straight on from the side, preferably in the fall. At least let you know, okay, this is where I have the best chance to be the most accurate agent. And what I tell folks is you very easily can break deer into 3 age classes. Young bucks, those that are that only 1 or 2 years old, middle-aged bucks, those that are 3 or 4 years old, and then mature bucks, those that are 5 or older. So we will go through today each individual age class, and I'll share with you the basic characteristics for each. But even if folks can't quite differentiate between all those, they, with a little bit of practice, can really easy put them into one of those 3 classes that we just talked about.
Yeah, and we're talking a lot about body characteristics here, and I think, antlers probably tell part of the story, but maybe not as much of the story as maybe a lot of folks might think at the same time. Would that be somewhat accurate?
You're right. You are spot on. And antlers will dramatically bias what people will estimate a deer. So I tell people, cover the antlers, look at the body characteristics, and then if you absolutely cannot decide between 2 ages, go ahead and use the antlers to help break that tie. But do not use the antlers to age it, to estimate that age, because smaller antlers on an older deer will make you think it's younger. Bigger antlers on a younger deer will make you think it's older. So the antlers will fool you a lot. So just use the body characteristics and you'll be a lot better at estimating the actual age.
So,
What?
What's
Jim,
up,
Jim, I was just going to say, for me, generally, just the presence of antlers would be my determining factor of whether or not I maybe want to try and take that buck.
Oh, I know how that goes.
It's got horns.
Pretty much in the same group, but so you got to be able to catch these things basically if you can. Ideally, side on, right? I mean, broadside if you can see it. What are the body characteristics then? What are you looking for?
We're looking at the depth of the neck and just like how big around the neck is. We are looking at the musculature in the shoulders. We are looking at the length of the legs relative to the depth of the body. We're looking at how heavy the hindquarters are. We're looking at where the stomach connects. So is that stomach drop down, or is it a big old belly sag, or is the stomach really tight? And we're looking at how straight the back is. Is it swayed? Is there a shoulder hump, or is that back real tight? So those are the main characteristics that you can see best when it's broadside. And look, I've been a wildlife biologist for a long time, but I am first and foremost a deer hunter. So I'm well aware that they rarely will stand there perfectly and let you estimate all of that. But if given the chance, don't bet your favorite bow or your gun or your truck on the age of a deer that you're estimating. But if you can, try to get a good profile view, whether it's in the field or a picture, because those will allow you to do the best job taking a look at those characteristics that we'll use to estimate whether it's 1 or 2 or 3 or something different.
So all those different factors that you went through, and of course it might take us 7 hours, but that was a lot of stuff there. But could you walk us through kind of what each of those different things might mean when you're trying to determine that age of that buck?
Yep, absolutely. And let's start with a 1.5-year-olds. So a 1.5-year-old buck, the legs are very long relative to the depth of the body. And that's because they're putting almost all of their energy into body growth. So they tend to get as tall as they can, but they're very lanky. So they often have a jacked up appearance, which means the hind end looks higher than the front end. So legs are really long, a lanky body, little bit of swelling in the neck during the rut, not very much at all. Shoulders don't have much musculature in them at all. They have a really tight waist. We can then look at the antlers. The antlers are almost always inside their ears from an antler spread standpoint. So, if that deer is looking at you and its ears are forward in an alert position, antler spread is almost always less than the width of those ears. So those characteristics make it, in most cases, pretty easy to differentiate a yearling buck from any of the other age classes.
Okay. That makes sense. Sounds like, well, it sounds weird to say now when I was comparing it to like a human, younger kid, but
I mean, there are some parallels
because you're hunting these and you're not hunting a kid. But anyway, there's some similarities in just that, you just get lanky, like stuff starts growing, and
a little bit awkward.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly right. A lot of parallels there. So let's add 1 year to them, and then say once they're 2.5, their legs still look a little too long for the body. They still have that jacked up appearance in the back. However, we now see more swelling in that neck during the rut. So not real big yet, but definitely bigger than we saw at 1.5 years. We still can see the brisket. That's very well defined. That neck is still hooking way up high on the brisket. And essentially what happens is as they get older and that neck continues to get bigger and bigger, it appears as it's just hooking lower and lower on that neck until finally at full maturity, it just blends smoothly right into the brisket. But until that point, the brisket is very well defined. So at 1.5, the brisket's sticking way out. At 2.5, it's still mostly sticking out, but that neck is hooking a little bit lower on that. So we see a little bit of muscling in the shoulders there. Still it's apparent it's a really young deer, but you know what? It just looks like it has a little more overall body mass than what we saw at 1.5 years.
Okay. It does always amaze me, and maybe it's because I just grew up hunting blacktails, which are a little bit more petite deer. But even and of course probably regional differences as well. So I guess I'm speaking in terms of like Wisconsin deer or Midwest type deer. But man, those 2-year-olds can have a big body on them sometimes.
They absolutely can, and they can absolutely fool people. I have pictures of both yearling and 2.5-year-old bucks from Wisconsin and Minnesota that body size wise are way bigger than some deer that we see in the southern U.S. However, and people will get fooled by looking at that overall body size.
Mm-hmm.
So what I encourage people is don't let the overall body size fool you. Look for those body characteristics within that animal. So even, a 2-year-old buck, say in Minnesota or Wisconsin, that may weigh 150, 160 pounds. He still will have characteristics that are very indicative of a 2-year-old deer. Neck still isn't real heavy at the bottom, still has a very tight waist, back is really tight. He's still pretty lean. So might be a big animal, but relative to other animals in that region, his body characteristics still show that he's pretty young.
Yeah,
okay. That's good to know.
I like that. It's like regardless of scale, those different, I guess, determining factors or whatever are still present. So yeah, that's super cool. I shot a buck this year with the rifle that it was a nice 8-point, but just a tanker of a body on it, like enough that I was like, man, this is a big bodied deer. And then another person in the group shot a buck that day that antler wise actually was dwarfed the buck that I shot. Like I was like, this is like the smallest antlered, biggest bodied deer, you'll ever see. And I have to think that I actually shot. I had my buck aged. I don't know about their deer, but I actually have to think that I shot a small antlered 3-year-old, and he shot a big antlered 2-year-old. At least that's what I speculate just by. And I wouldn't have really, but I saw them next to one another, and I was like, and again, but I wasn't looking for those specifics. Like I was looking at just the general scale. Exactly, comparison. So maybe they were both 3-year-olds. I don't know, but maybe I just had a big fat 3-year-old and he had a small 3-year-old. But I'd be curious to. I wish I could go back now and really compare some of those finer points between the two.
Well, speaking of 3-year-olds, then let's talk about the characteristics for that. This is where they really start changing. So those 1 and 2-year-olds, I said that has that jacked up appearance. If you look at a buck and his hind end looks heavier than the front end, you're almost guaranteed that he's only 1 or 2 years old. So that age class, hind end heavier than the front. By 3 years old, that reverses. For the first time now, the front end looks much heavier than the back end. And in 3-year-old bucks now, the legs appear to be about the right length for the body, so they don't look too long anymore. You see a lot more swelling in that neck during the rut. It's connecting a little lower on the chest. And you see a lot of muscling in the shoulders, heavy, heavy front end. And the 3-year-olds are often talked about as being, a racehorse appearance or a buffalo appearance, where they have that big, deep chest, but a very tight waist in the back. So a 3-year-old's front end looks way heavier. If you're a football fan, I talk about these guys as being like the middle linebackers of the NFL. They are big and they're strong, but they're lean and they're fast. So a 3-year-old, big, heavy chest, but still a very tight waist in the back. So an entirely different looking deer than what we have seen up to this point.
I like to think of myself as a 3-year-old buck, Jim.
Who wouldn't?
It's not reality, but I like to think that
I think
way.
when you grew the beard, that's what happened, because everybody said, man, you know what? Now he looks more substantial up top, and he still remains nice and trim. Anyway, but I'm not gonna keep going on. But
what about like I said, it's just one of those things that you can look at, but maybe generally like antlers between maybe a 2 and 3-year-old.
Big jumps in antlers. Regardless of how big bucks are going to be at maturity, they can only put on a certain amount of antler growth at any individual age class. 1-year-old bucks can only achieve 15 to 25% of their antler growth potential. By 2, that jumps to 25 to 50% of their antler growth potential. From 2 to 3, it jumps from 50 to 75%. So for those first few years of life, it's huge gains. And the reason for that is almost everything they're eating is going to body growth early on. Antlers are secondary to all of that. So they only go to nutrition there once the body has been satisfied. So early on, almost everything has to go to body growth. So they just don't have that much to put to antlers. But each successive year, they're not growing quite as much. They're able to, put more nutrition to antlers. So big jumps from 1 to 2 and 2 to 3.
Interesting.
And then one more huge jump from 3 to 4. So for a 4-year-old buck, now the front end and the hind end appear about the same body-wise. What happens is that chest is even a little deeper, but the waist now drops down, so it's about even with his chest. So, and for the first time, we start seeing legs that look maybe a little short for the body. The legs obviously haven't gotten any shorter. It's just that body is developing down and getting bigger, that there's just not as much room between the ground, and their belly anymore. So legs look a little short. Neck now gets tremendous swelling during the rut. You almost can't see the differentiation at the brisket anymore. The neck is almost blending seamlessly into it. Big, heavy shoulders, big, heavy neck. The waist now is big. Hind end looks as big as the front end. And all of a sudden you realize, you know what? This is definitely a different deer than we have seen up to this point. And they get their last really big jump in antler growth. From 3 to 4, they go from 75 now to 90% of what their antler growth potential is. Mm-hmm. And that range that I'm giving you there is really dependent on the amount of quality food they get. If there's too many deer, they don't have enough to eat, they're going to be at the bottom end of that. Versus if there's the right number of deer for the habitat, there's lots of good food, they can be at the upper end of it and be able to express all of that genetic potential at, a little bit sooner than some other deer. So still a middle-aged deer, they're not fully mature yet, but man, a 4-year-old deer is a very special animal.
Yeah, for sure. I got a couple questions there. So, it seems like those environmental factors are like a really big deal for, expressing that maximum, potential antler growth. But there's also like a lot of other, I guess, probably actually more meaningful side benefits to those variables being in play and those deer being as healthy as possible. Yeah.
There is. And especially from the antlerless side, it takes a lot of energy to grow antlers. There's no doubt. But it takes way more energy to feed a fawn. That's the most energetically expensive thing that happens in a deer herd, is providing that high quality milk for fawns. And what many people don't realize is does always provide high quality milk. There is no difference in quality between a doe that's being starved and a doe that's having all the food she wants. Quality will be the same. The difference is that doe that's being starved only has a tiny amount of milk that she can feed her fawn. That doe that's on a high quality diet has an overabundant amount of milk. So, if you want to have a healthy deer herd, you absolutely have to feed those does, because they're the ones that are feeding those fawns that will then either be able to recruit them into the deer herd, or, they don't make it. They get eaten by a predator, die of malnutrition or whatever. So yeah, it's important to have the right number of deer and good quality habitat, certainly for the bucks, because we want to see big deer and big antlers, but it's even more important for the antlerless side of it, so that they can get those fawns off to a good start and make sure that they can sustain that healthy population.
On average, how many, and maybe it's different for bucks versus does, but like, maybe we'll talk bucks first, but how many bucks percentage-wise are making it to 4? Like, how hard is it to get as a buck to make it to 4 years old?
20 years ago, it was almost impossible. 10 years ago, we started seeing a lot more of them. Today, we are seeing more bucks hit those older age classes like that than ever before. And it's a direct result of how we harvest deer. We've been monitoring the age structure of the buck harvest since 1989. And back then, almost 70% of all the bucks shot were only 1.5 years old. Okay. Very few bucks, 1 or 2% of the bucks, that was all that ever made it to maturity. Today, that's very different. The National Deer Association has been teaching people for a long time the value of protecting yearling bucks, of getting bucks into older age classes, so that you have a much more natural age structure. And today, hunters shoot a much higher number of bucks that are 3 years old or older than those that are just 1.5. So we have entirely flipped the script from what we've had in the past. And today, a much higher number of bucks reach those older age classes. During the 2019 into 2020 season, that's the most recent season that State Wildlife Agency has all of the harvest data analyzed and available for us. During that hunting season, only 28% of the of the bucks that were shot were 1, compared to 39% were 3 years old or older. So there's a big difference. So a big percentage of bucks today are hitting that 3, 4, 5, or 6 year old age class. So hunters are reaping the benefits, and it's very, very different than what we had in the past.
So the three and up percentage exceeded the 1.5-year-old percentage?
That's right. It's exceeded the 1.5-year-old percentage 2 of the last 3 hunting seasons. And in that 2019 to 2020 season was by far the biggest discrepancy between those 2 age classes.
Remarkable.
So, yep.
And
they were both national records.
And that's primarily due to, I think, the way that people are hunting then over, like, I'm trying to think of, in terms of just sheer numbers of how many deer get harvested. Is that up or down, or is that like, because I'm just wondering. It's such a significant change.
The answer,
like, what were people doing back 20 years ago that was so much different today? Or were there more people 20 years ago than there are, or something like, I mean, does that make sense? Mark, you were saying something.
Oh, I just was curious if it was a shift in hunter mindset, as far as, like all the stuff that you guys have taught over the years, and management, and also just like letting some of these younger bucks get older. Like, I mean, I think, and you can speak to it more than I could, but like, back in the day, if you saw a deer, that might be your only opportunity that you got a deer, and you shot it and you were stoked that you got your buck, which you always should be. But yeah, what's going on there? I know you touched on it, but maybe elaborate on that a little bit. Like what's happened?
We're shooting about 6 million whitetails today, which is very similar to what we were 20 years ago. The biggest difference is that change in mindset. Hunters today are passing yearling bucks, and there's really 2 reasons for that. One of them is some of them just willingly doing it. They know the benefits of passing them to see older bucks. They want to see older bucks. They want the opportunity to hunt older bucks. And part of it is driven by some state wildlife agencies. Over 20 states have regulations designed to protect the majority of yearling bucks, either antler point restrictions or antler spread restrictions, or a combination of those. So those 2 factors working together are what is driving the age structure. So, there's a lot of states that do not have antler restrictions that have some of the best age structures in the country, because hunters just are willingly passing 1-year-old bucks for the opportunity to hunt older ones.
Yep.
If deer are generally kind of like bucks are living longer, before getting hunted and harvested and all that, does that then raise competition for food for the younger ones that are coming up, or is it a better overall situation for all of the deer, or is it kind of like, does it then skew, like, how does then a younger buck make it through all the competition with the older ones to then become that next older buck, if that makes sense?
It's a lot better for those yearling bucks to have older bucks there, partly because deer evolved having very balanced age structures. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 and 10-year-old bucks out there. Those older bucks don't do all of the breeding, but they do the majority of it. And it's to the benefit of those very young bucks to have those older bucks there, because the younger ones can spend more time than feeding, going into winters in better shape, so that they can enhance their survival rate coming out of winter. If they are forced to do the majority of the breeding, while they're during the breeding season, bucks eat very little. In some cases, they may go a month without eating at all. They can lose 20 to 25% of their body weight. Well, it's not good for a yearling buck to do that if he can go ahead and continue to eat, go into winter better, if older bucks are out there taking care of a lot of the breeding. It just sets him up long term for a higher chance of survival. So can yearling bucks do the breeding? Absolutely. They can do it all, but it's way better for them from a nutritional standpoint if those older bucks are out there, so that the younger bucks don't have to do all that.
I guess I didn't realize that. It almost seems like the bucks have just this sense for how things are doing, like how the herd is doing and how things are going with the breeding during the rut, because I guess otherwise, like a younger doe wouldn't be able to see like, oh, the older does, or a younger buck wouldn't be able to see like, oh, the older bucks are doing the majority of the breeding right now, so I don't have to, if you will. I just always thought it was kind of like free for all. Like, if you're a buck, you're out there trying to breed regardless of if you're a young one or an old one, and everybody's just fighting each other. But that almost doesn't seem to be the case.
Well, they are. It absolutely is. The younger bucks are interested in it.
Okay.
And if those older bucks are there, they're just inhibiting them from a bunch of those activities.
Okay.
So it's not that the young guys say, all right, I'm just not going to do this. They're still trying. They're just those older bucks. The presence of those older bucks just doesn't allow them to participate at the level that they would like.
Okay, now I'm following, and that makes sense. Got it.
Yeah, I mean, it does make perfect sense, and like you said, I mean, that is way better for those bucks they're those younger bucks that their primary, at least what their body is trying to do is like they are trying to put on weight. They are developing that body mass and that bone structure and to just really wear that down during a critical time of year, essentially going into winter, that's kind of setting you up for failure for sure. So that's definitely, shows kind of the benefit of having that, all those age classes represented within the herd. So what's optimal as far as, and it probably depends on the landscape too, but like deer per, or maybe it just depends on the landscape. So there's no right answer, but like, deer per square mile, like you hear some like crazy high numbers. Sometimes you hear low numbers, like up in the big woods. What's going on there? And I guess what's optimal for the deer herd there?
Yeah, that's all over the board, what the habitat can support. I've worked in places in Florida, and I've worked in places in northern New England that just weren't very productive habitats, and so really areas that could probably only adequately sustain somewhere around 5 deer per square mile, 10 deer per square mile tops. I have been in other places in numerous states where active habitat management was going on, and they were really doing a good job from a forestry end, from an old field or early successional vegetation end, and from a food plot end, that they could easily withstand over 50 deer per square mile, and keep deer in absolute top health. Habitat was healthy, deer were healthy. So there's no right answer, or there's no one answer, I should say, for what somebody can sustain, because in any environment, whether it's Florida, New England, or anywhere in between, I can show you examples of areas, because they're just not doing that much active habitat management, that can't sustain many deer per square mile, and others right down the road that could sustain 3, 4, or 5 times as many deer in an even better condition.
Yeah, that's crazy. Just the variance there, and the contrast between just like, the habitat and the carrying capacities of one landscape over another, and just the difference in the number of animals it can support. Super cool. And I guess it's a testament to, quality habitat and management and things that just natural landscapes that they might have in place, or things that, as a human being, you can manipulate things at time, but still maintain the health of that herd, but also increase those numbers.
Mm-hmm. Are we to the point, do we talk about on the hoof? I feel like a good bit. Are we to the point where we talk about now maybe you shot one and you're wondering, is there more there, Kip, to aging on the hoof?
We actually have, let's talk about the last age class, which are the mature animals. So we've made it up through 4.5. I'm going to group the next 3 ages together. So 5 to 7. And the reason for that is they're fully mature from a body standpoint then. And somewhere between 5 and 7 years is typically where they will grow their largest set of antlers. So difference from 4 years old to 5 then, or 5 to 7 is now you have all those same characteristics where legs look a little short for the body, huge chest, huge neck. But now what we see is that neck just blends smoothly right into the belly. So the brisket is no longer apparent. That neck is just so big and heavy that it's just one smooth mass all the way in. Mm-hmm. Hindquarters are huge, but it's somewhere between 5 and 6 now. We also developed this belly that's sagging. So we get a sagging belly and a sway back. So these animals are right at the peak of, maturity and just about to tip and go over the other way. So they are, body size wise, they're very big. They are fully mature. You can look at them and just know, man, this is just a stud of an animal. And then somewhere in there is where they get that largest set of antlers.
Got it.
Yeah. And like you said, that animal right there that you're describing, and I haven't seen a whole lot of them in the wild, but because they are so special, at least they're rare to me, Jim. But man, they are just stout. Beefy. They kind of look like a beef cow in a way, just like that body mass, like you said, that sagging belly, that sway back, that neck that really isn't even a neck anymore. It's like that huge bodybuilding weightlifter neck, right?
Yeah.
That's super interesting. And so they're getting there. their largest set of antlers, between that 5 to 7 range, what can also, I guess, potentially, so if they get their largest set at 5, you oftentimes hear like, oh, that's an old regress buck, like he's on that downward trend. When can that start to happen, or how often does that in reality happen? Because I know, like, I've even been like, oh, that's an old regress buck. I'm like, nope, that buck's 2. But but what's going on?
A lot.
What's going on there? Like, how often you hear about it, but how often is that really happening?
Yeah, it does happen. It typically doesn't happen until they're 8 or more years old, though. Somewhere, 8 and on, they start just going the other way. And just like if you guys have ever, you've seen dogs that once they're past their prime, you can just tell that they're older. They get that loose skin around the eyes and a lot of times on the shoulders. Oftentimes, they're losing body weight. They still maintain these big bellies, but they lose a lot of musculature in the front end and the hind end.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes, they look a little knock-kneed. Their hips may stick out a little bit. They're just not as healthy as they were, at 5 or 6 or 7. And then their antlers definitely start going the other way. So a lot of people will call a young buck. They'll say, oh, yeah, he used to be bigger. And you're absolutely right. No, probably not. He's still very young. But it's amazing the number of deer that are hitting these, very, post-mature or post-prime age classes now, into those 8, 9, 10, 11 years old even, just because once they get to those older age classes, it's very hard to kill them. And some slip through. And, we're seeing more deer in those age classes than we have in the past. So they're a little more difficult to estimate with that. But, it absolutely will go downhill antler-wise as well once you get into them.
What, and then, we're talking, gosh, that's such amazingly old deer to think about when you're talking about even that 5 to 7 range. But, I mean, what are you guys seeing as far as, like, even just some outliers as far as bucks that are getting to, like, that, like, 9, 10? Like, what's the oldest buck that you guys are seeing in the wild?
There's lots of accounts of bucks in the wild well up into their teens, and late into their teens. And one of the ways that we can age deer once that they've been harvested, and we can talk about this here in a minute, is by pulling in an incisor and doing a cementum annuli analysis. There's a lab out of Montana that's done more cementum annuli analysis than anybody in the world. And they keep track of the oldest animal of all the different species that they've done. And they have deer there that they've cementum annuli aged out more than 20 years old, wild deer. So they typically aren't living that old, but they can. Some of them make it that long.
That's crazy. So what's that process, which I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce, Kip. But so what's the biologist or the person that's doing that analysis, like, what are they doing with that tooth?
All right, so we're going to say, now we've seen that deer. We decided, I'm going to go ahead and shoot it. Now you have it in your hand. So if you can pull that jawbone, there's 2 ways that we can estimate age from that jawbone. One of them is to look at the teeth on the back of the jawbone, the premolars and the molars, and then based on which teeth are erupted and the wear on those teeth, we can immediately estimate how old that deer is.
Mark, we got a
that
jawbone
is
right there.
More accurate than cementum annuli that I talked about for young deer. Cementum annuli uses the incisors, which are those teeth at the very front of that lower jaw of a deer. You pull those incisors, and all mammals add a layer of cementum each year they're alive. And basically, it's like looking at the rings in a tree. If you cut a tree down, you can count the growth rings. It's a very similar process. Now, it's not exactly a layer of cementum per year, but it's more like a layer of cementum during a time of hardship during the year. So for us in the north, that works extremely well because we get winter every year, and it's very different from summer. Those in the southern U.S., it doesn't work nearly as good for because you can't differentiate. There's just not much of a difference between summer and winter there. So the break point seems to be somewhere around southern Missouri. If you're below that line, cementum annuli aging just doesn't work that well. If you're north of that line, it actually works very well and is the preferred way to estimate age for older animals.
Okay, gotcha. So, and then, so going back to, that being the preferred way, with that lower jawbone, maybe walk us through that, I guess, the transition right from, that 1.5-year-old buck or even, a buck fawn all the way up to that fully mature animal and, tooth eruption and what you're seeing and, and where that you're seeing along the way.
Okay, sounds good. So when deer are born, we're going to look at the teeth in the back of the jaw. So the deer have 3 premolars and 3 molars. So if you have a jaw in your hand and you're looking at those teeth in the back and there are less than 6 teeth, it is a fawn. Guaranteed every single time. It's a fawn. Because by the time they're 1.5 years old, they will have all 6 of those teeth. Now, there is the very rare occasion where an adult deer only has 5 teeth. I've seen them. I've seen deer with 7 teeth, but I have literally aged thousands and thousands of jawbones. And I've only seen deer with less than 6 teeth 2 or 3 times. So hold the jawbone, less than 6 teeth, it's a fawn. Guaranteed. If you look at that and it has 6 teeth, 3 premolars and 3 molars, then that deer is at least 1.5 years old. Guaranteed. Now, the way that we're going to tell that it is 1.5, there's 2 things we can look at. The third tooth back, which is the last premolar, when that deer is born, that tooth has 3 cusps on it. And they replace it somewhere around 20 months of age, 18 to 20 months. So if you have a jaw and it has 6 teeth, you know it's 1.5 at least. And if that last tooth back still has 3 cusps, you're guaranteed it's 1.5 because it's just about to replace that tooth. And when it replaces it, it comes in with only 2 cusps. So the quickest way to tell is 6 teeth, it's at least 1.5. If the last molar has 3 cusps, 100% guaranteed the deer is 1.5 years old.
And what part of the tooth is the cusp then?
Grab this bad boy. Can we see anything?
Those are
no. Behind the head.
Oh, yeah, I didn't see that.
The crest that you're looking at on there, and so if you can count back, the third tooth, and sometimes it's always good to look at that jawbone from the cheek side, which you're doing there. I can see what you got. So you got the cheek side.
Right.
So sometimes it's nice to be able to look on the inside to just figure out exactly where each tooth stops and each tooth starts.
Oh, sure enough.
And I'll tell you, we have a great series of videos on our website with some pictures that show this. We can get with you and you can show, because it draws a line to each of those different teeth so that people can understand, oh, okay, this is the first one, this is the second tooth, this is the third one. But that third tooth back, if it has 3 cusps, guaranteed 1.5 years old. The way that we can also check that is if you go to the last tooth in the mouth, all the way back, by the back of the jaw.
Yeah.
The last cusp of the last tooth does not erupt until that deer is 2.5 years old. So you can go look at that. And if that's just barely popped through the gum line or hasn't at all yet, got to be 1.5. Can't be anything else.
What do you think, Marco?
We've just completely talked through this entire thing, and I don't know how old this deer is.
This wasn't a deer that we shot. This was a jawbone that I found out just walking around one time. So I don't know how intact it really is. But I do feel like you've got 6 teeth though, at least, because you've got 1, 2, 3, and then you got 4, 5, 6 here, and on this very back one, right? Is that kind of how? Is that kind of how it works?
At least 1.
Sure.
So let's talk then about what happens at 2.5, and this will give you a better idea of, is this likely 1 or at least 2?
Mm-hmm.
So 6 teeth, we know it's at least 1. When they become 2 years old, 6 teeth is the most they're going to get. So at 2, it has 6 teeth.
Mm-hmm.
That third tooth back now, though, has been replaced, so it only has 2 cusps rather than 3.
Cusps are just the points, right?
That's right. Yeah.
I think that's one correct. Just has 2, right?
I think it just has 2.
And you check it by looking at the last cusp of the last tooth. If that's fully erupted, the deer has got to be at least 2.5 years old. Cannot be less than that.
I think it might be.
Looks fully erupted to me.
Yeah.
So, all right. So what you have then there is a deer that's at least 2.5. Now, what we have just talked about there, as long as you can count to 6 and be able to tell whether that tooth is erupted, you can 100% of the time accurately identify deer as a fawn, a 1.5-year-old, or a deer that is at least 2.5.
Okay.
And that is called the tooth eruption and wear technique. And that is more accurate for those 3 age classes than even the cementum annuli technique is for them.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, and now once we can identify, okay, this deer is at least 2.5. Now we'll use the wear part of the technique, the amount of tooth wear, to estimate, is it more likely 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or some other age class? So now here's where the subjectivity comes in, and here's where some of the accuracy of the technique goes down. And for this part of it, what we're going to do is you want to look at that jaw straight down onto the top of the jaw. And we're going to look at the first molar, which is the 4th tooth back.
Okay.
So find your 4th tooth
On it.
And what we want to look at is there's 2 different colors you'll see there. The white is the enamel.
Sure.
The brown is the dentine. And as that deer ages, it wears those teeth down so the points or the crests aren't as sharp.
Okay.
And as they wear down, it exposes more of the dentine. So the width of that layer of brown gets wider as that deer gets older.
I'm actually seeing a fair bit of brown on this one.
Yeah.
So,
right here.
Okay, very good. So what we want to do is look at that 4th tooth. So that's the first molar.
Yeah.
And what we ask ourselves is the width of dentine, which is the width of that brown, is that wider than the width of enamel beside it? So the white on either side of it. It doesn't matter which side of the dentine.
It
as long as
is.
you're looking at the crest, the top crest. Every part of the tooth has a higher crest and a lower.
Mm-hmm.
Don't look at the lower part. Just look at the higher part.
I would say it is, or it's about even. In our case, in the one that we're looking at here now,
It's about even, but I'd say at the crest, at the top, it actually is. Like you said, there's some subjectivity there. I'm going to go with even, actually, Jim. I think you're right.
So what we do here is, if we say at that first molar, is the dentine as wide as the enamel? If you can say, yes, it's at least as wide,
yes,
that means that deer is at least 3.5 years old. We move back, then we'll go 1 tooth toward the back.
Okay.
And ask that same question again.
All right, got it.
So now you're at the 5th tooth. And you ask, is that
This guy
dentine
right here.
as wide as the enamel? We just keep doing that until you say no. And when you say no, we stop. So the very first time you did that, if you just said, no, the dentine is not as wide as the enamel, we just said no, that suggests that deer is only 2.5 years old.
I would say on
If
this.
you say yes on the first one like you did, that deer is at least 3.5 years old, we move back 1 tooth and ask that same question again. So is the dentine as wide as the enamel on the next tooth back?
In this case, I'd say it's narrower. Just looking at
Okay,
these
so we
top
say
crests.
no.
Because if you look at the bottom ones, it does good. It is interesting. Gosh, it's so weird seeing all this actually in practice. I'm glad we had this job, but we've had it here for years.
This has been setting here for no other reason than setting here. Yeah, I would say, once we got there, I would go with no on that one, Jim.
Correct.
It's close, though. It's close.
Okay,
but
so we just go until you say no. So if you say no at the first tooth, it's 2.5 years old. If you say yes at the first tooth, go back and ask it again.
Mhm.
You just said no at the second, which means we stop there. So a yes at the first one, a no at the second one means that deer is likely at least 3.5 years old.
How about that?
If you could have said yes on that second tooth as well, that would mean the deer is at least 4.5 years old. And if you could have said yes on all 3 of the molars, would suggest the deer is at least 5.5. And then
Wow.
they really can't age it after that. They just,
Sure.
5.5 plus, they kind of all get added together.
That's really cool. And this is, I don't know, it probably doesn't make any difference. I'll throw it out there. This was off of a doe skull that I found walking around. Is it different for does and bucks, or is it basically the same across the board?
Nope, it's exactly the same. Some people will say, well, it matters where they come from. If they're in an area that they have real sandy soils, or if they're coming from the mountains and they're eating rocks and they wear their teeth faster. That is not true. And there's been research to show deer tested in very sandy areas versus very loamy areas versus the Midwest, wear patterns are very similar across the board.
Because that was a question that I was going to have. Does I guess predominant food sources or food types. Like I picture like, a buck that has just tons of access to acorns. They seem pretty crunchy versus, a deer that's like, whatever, I'm making this up, but strictly on alfalfa, but so no, the food type doesn't make a difference there, huh?
Does not seem to make any difference. No. So what we just did there in its simplicity is that's how you age based on the jawbone. Now there are some ways that we can do checks to see, is it likely what they saw? Because like you said, that's really close, whether that dentine is wider or not.
Yeah.
You can look at the last cusp of the last molar. At 2.5, that has just erupted. So, there's no wear or maybe just a tiny bit of wear in that. At 3.5, we see a little bit of wear. At 4.5, that thing is really see it sliding off from wear. At 5.5. So it's just kind of a check that we can do. Now this is not an exact science either after 2.5, like I said, but you can, if you study this a little bit, practice with some jawbones, you can get really good at doing this. Mm-hmm. And I'll say this provides a minimum age. That deer may be older than that, but it will not be younger than that. And for deer that are fawns, 1 or 2 years old, that the wear pattern, the wear technique is more accurate than the cementum annuli. Mm-hmm. For deer that are 3.5 years old, accuracy is about equal between the wear technique and the cementum annuli technique. For deer that are 4 years old and older, the cementum annuli technique is more accurate than the wear technique. And, we can talk about that next if you'd like.
I wonder if some of the reason, too, why some of this stuff was kind of a in-betweener, like we kind of couldn't, it was sort of in-between, is actually because this was found, coming back now, during morel hunting in the spring.
Okay, right.
So, it's not like a something and a half. It would have been like, full-on kind of in between when you've seen a lot of deer probably that go to
maybe,
the fall.
Yeah. I guess it depends on when and how it died.
Got that little extra half, but you can also tell too, like you said, there's those there's the inside ones that stick up a little bit more. Those are the ones you got to look at, because otherwise, if you look at the bottom portions, then you just see a lot of dentine all the way back. You'd age it super old.
That's right.
Yeah. Huh, man, that was pretty cool, pretty fun.
What you say though, Jim, is exactly right. We age deer in half years because they're born in the spring, and we tend to shoot them in the fall. But for one that you picked up, yes, that one could have died in the spring, so that could have been right on, the full year. Mm-hmm. So all of the studies on the aging by looking at wear are based on the half year increments. So yeah, if that deer died, during the winter and the spring, it would make it much more difficult to figure, which side of this line is it on?
Yeah.
I'll use that as our crutch for being like, I don't know. It's not that we're not master deer agers, Jim. It's just, there's no way to determine.
Ah, yes, exactly. But yeah, so you said next you'd go into the cementum annuli?
Good job. That's exactly right. So all mammals put that layer of cementum down each year. They just, bears, bobcats, humans, deer, and everything else. For deer, the way that the lab can measure it is to pull an incisor, which are the middle teeth are the ones that they want, in the front and the bottom, middle ones. Pull those out, send them to a lab. Now, unlike the wear pattern or wear technique that we just did, where anybody can do it, you can do it immediately, in the bed of your truck or at camp or in the field. For cementum annuli, you have to have some specialized equipment, and you have to wait and send it away to a lab. Mm-hmm. Because what they're going to do is we pull that incisor, and they need the roots of it. They're not going to cut it crossways like we would a tree, how we see those, but they have a special saw that actually sections it lengthwise. And it takes a tiny, tiny, thin slice out of the root of that tooth. They'll then decalcify it, stain it, put it on a microscope slide, and then count the rings under a microscope. Now, this is not something that you guys or me or the average person off the street is going to be able to do, and I'm really good at it. Anybody can get good at aging deer based on the wear on the jawbone, but it takes a lot of practice to get good at doing this cementum annuli aging because of the extra steps involved. But what the lab, and there's only a couple labs in the United States that do this commercially. What they'll do then is section it, stain it, decalcify it, look at it, and then from that be able to count growth rings and give you an estimate of how old this deer is. what they will also do is give you a grade for that. So they might say 3.5 years old with an A grade. What that means is we saw wear patterns that were very clearly identified. We feel really, really confident that this deer is 3. Or they may say 3, with a B grade, which means, boy, you know what? We feel kind of good about it, but something just wasn't right with the growth rings, or the root wasn't that good, or maybe it came from, kind of mid-USA where there just wasn't real good definition between them. So they kind of give you a confidence score on that as well. So, but this is really cool to do, particularly for older deer. We send the teeth from every buck that we shoot on our farm in each year, and from all of the old does. And over the years, from a place where we get after the antlerless deer. I mean, high hunting pressure. We have shot antlerless deer that were 2 of them that were 13.5 years old.
Man.
And we had 1 antlerless deer that was 15.5 years old, all based on cementum annuli records. So how cool is that? So it's just crazy to think how old some of these deer get, even in areas where harvest rates are pretty high.
That is wild.
That is unbelievable. And I suppose even on your, if you had a property where you're able to harvest, at least a decent sample size of deer, you could get somewhat of an idea of the age structure that you have going on as well. Like I said, it's not a giant sample size, but a little bit of a window into there. And man, that is not how I pictured that process occurring. Like I assumed, just a cross section. We talk about it in terms of like similar to a tree. So I was picturing, the growth rings on a tree, but that's interesting with the roots and kind of like that more vertical cross section.
Oh, I bet it'd be a super interesting process to watch.
Sounds painful. I don't like going to the dentist.
Oh, I know. I was getting a little funny feeling in my jaw.
I know.
Good thing we don't have Ryan Muckenhart up here who had a split molar a couple of years back.
That he just dealt with.
His
for
head
so
would
long.
be ringing right now listening to that. Man, that's pretty cool. I wish that I would have just taken even just a gander at the jaw on the doe that I shot this year.
That was a big doe.
I know, she was big doe, and like, of course, too, I mean, you're sending in, like, I was ready to get all the meat, right, and, like, do all that processing, so I wanted to get the head off for CWD testing ASAP, so I sent that off, and I didn't even think to check the jaw, and then, with a doe, you kind of kiss that goodbye, and when you send it off for the testing, and so I don't know, but I would have been really curious.
Where does a person, you said there's kind of some limited facilities that'll, conduct these practices. Where does a person send it to? And what tooth are they pulling again themselves?
It's the incisor. And actually the labs want 2 inside. They want the middle 2 teeth in the front.
Okay.
So those are both incisors. And what they do is they use one of them. And then if, it's the root wasn't real good or something wasn't just right, they have the second one kind of for a backup. So they ask you to provide the 2 middle teeth. The one is Matson's Lab, and it's in Montana. MatsonsLab.com is the website. The other one is DeerAge.com. That's the other commercial lab that does this. DeerAge.com will do it for a single tooth. So you just pay them. It's a $25 fee. They will age it for you. You wait. I know you can pay extra to get it back quicker, but that's what it costs for that service. Matson's, which has been doing it the longest, and they do it for all the state wildlife agencies. They have a minimum $75 order. They will age 5 teeth for that price, but it's more expensive there, partly because they've been doing it the longest and they're the best at it. And with them, it's about a 3-month wait time to get your teeth back. Partly because they're just doing it, such a high volume for state and federal wildlife agencies. But fortunately, they do offer the service for hunters. That's where I send mine. We send all of ours in late December after our firearm season is done. And if you get them in by January 1st, I get the results back every March. So I guess 2.5 months you're waiting for those.
Okay.
Cool. Makes spring a little bit, late winter, early spring a little bit more interesting. Yeah.
Got something to look forward to. I'm gonna pitch this at home and say, like, hey, I want to get this deer aged, but I need to reach a certain volume. Therefore, I need to go hunting more and shoot more deer if we're gonna get any of these deer aged.
Because of the age.
I think that'll. I think that's a solid pitch. That ought to work.
Well, it gives you a quota to try and hit pretty much every year. Yeah.
That's super cool. I like that. What's Like, what's the best way for a person to, like, is it easy to extract those teeth? Do they need to be careful not to break them in that process? How does a person do that?
They do need to be careful not to break them. More importantly, they need to be careful not to cut themselves. It's very simple to do. What you do is you just take a knife, a thin bladed knife, put it in between the two middle incisors, and just cut down into the jaw. Pull your blade up, move it over, put it on the outside of that incisor, cut down into the jaw, put it on the other side. So anyway, you just do that 3 times so that you have both sides of the two middle incisors. Take your fingers or a pair of needle nose pliers, put it over that incisor, and then just turn it down, and it'll pop right out.
Okay.
If the jaw is fresh, it's super easy. If the jaw is dry, just stick it in a pail of water for 5 or 10 minutes. Let that bone soften up a little bit, and then cut it. So, and then, you don't want to have a bunch of extra meat on that root, but do not scrape that root clean, because then you're scraping away the parts that they need to look at. So I just cut alongside each of those incisors, pop them out of there, take that, let it sit out for 5 or 10 minutes. That will dry. I put it just in a little like key envelope, and then it's all set to go. Don't put it in a Ziploc, because then it won't dry properly. You just want it to air dry. And then you're ready. You can wait a day, a month, 2 months, or whatever to be able to send it in. But it's super easy to extract it. They show you on the website how to do it too. But what I just told you makes it very easy. And just be careful not to cut yourself, because as people are pushing with that knife, and that's the most dangerous part of the whole thing. For sure.
Safety first.
Sounds like my dad, the old school dentist, trying to get help me pull teeth. Oh, Jimmy, you got a loose tooth? Let me get my knife out.
Yeah. Oh, you got a toothache? Well, let's eliminate the problem. Kip, I was going to ask, are you aware of any, like, attributes, like, in the skull itself? Like, I'm holding up a buck here that Jim shot, and Eric in the office and I were talking about this, but kind of, it seems like on older deer, in this little part where the skull appears to kind of fuse together, there's like this little bump between the antlers. On older deer, it appears to be a little bit more pronounced. Is there any substance to that, or is that any sort of indicator that a person can look at?
Not really on that bump. There are some species that you can look at those where the bones grow together. Look at those fission layers, and from that estimate age a little bit, but not really for deer. They're just not a long enough lived species to have much to go on based on that. So, you may be able to look at something on that and just see the sheer size of those pedicles, which is, what the antlers grow off of, to be able to estimate, hey, is this deer, likely middle age or older versus younger? But there's nothing specific from that skull that you could tie it to a definitive age class.
Okay.
Good to know.
That is good to know.
I bet that one was like a 1.5 to 2.5 old deer.
If I was going to speculate, of course we don't have his bottom jaw. Can you tell anything from the upper jaw, from the top jaw?
Not really.
Not really.
No, you need the lower jaw. All of the work on that technique has been done based on the lower jaw, and they've done a little bit of work trying to compare lower and upper, and the wear patterns just simply don't hold that way. So you could look at the upper jaw and tell, is it probably closer to 1 or 5, but you couldn't tell, is it more likely 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 at all, like you can with the lower jaw.
Like if I was going to look at this deer, Jim, if you just asked me right now, I'd say, yep, that's a nice 1.5-year-old deer.
Right.
And that's going off of some of the stuff that Kip was talking about earlier with, like, okay, are those antlers, inside the ears? Yes, they are.
Pedicles aren't very big.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But hell of a hunt, though. It's the size of the hunt, Jim. That's what I always say.
Right. That's right. And the buffalo that was on Overwatch just about 50 yards up the hill.
Right. So we say we measure memories, in smiles, not inches of antler.
Man, that is.
I'm sorry. We measure success. We measure success in memories.
Yes.
And smiles, not inches of antler.
Yep. Absolutely.
Agree with that one. 10,000%. I like big bucks as much as the next guy, but man, like you said, those aren't the defining things. That's for sure.
This is something that I'm gonna do just from now on. I'm just gonna check this stuff out because it's pretty. It's just kind of fun to do your own little bit of forensics. And of course, if you find it's an older one, you send it off to get the names escaping me, but you do the little bit more. Send it off to a lab, do something like that. It's just kind of neat. It's pretty cool knowing. And of course, I'm sure if you're into like really, which I haven't gotten to or graduated myself to yet in terms of like management of a certain unit or whatever. But if you are into that, then there's a lot of strategy I'm sure you can achieve from knowing the ages of things that you're shooting and whatnot. But it's pretty cool. It's just like a fun process to do, I think.
No, I can't wait, Kip. And it sounds like, I mean, we covered a lot of really cool ground here, too, and I definitely learned a lot. But it sounds like you guys have developed some awesome resources on your end that a person can reference as far as, like, drawings and diagrams and things that note a lot of the stuff that we talked about today.
We do, yeah. Go right to our website, to deerassociation.com, and we have videos on there, that you can look at that show somebody pointing to each of those teeth and describing, what we talked about today. We have pictures on there that you can look at and be able to very easily follow through. We have a poster that we sell. I think it's $10. It is by far the best resource ever because it shows an example of a jawbone from each of those different age classes.
Cool. And
points out to all the stuff that we talked about. I have traveled the country. White-tailed deer have been very good to me. I've been all over the U.S., and I can't tell you how many of those posters I've seen in hunting camps, in sheds, and in barns, because they take the jawbone, and you can literally line it right up to what's on there and see, is this more likely 2 or 3 or 4 or whatever. So, but yeah, lots of free stuff on our website that folks can go and take a look at to learn how to do this.
We might need that poster, a new decoration for the old podcast studio, Jim.
We got some room. Sweet. Well, yeah, that's awesome. Kip, really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, super fascinating, super interesting. Probably going to cost me an extra at least $25 a year now, hopefully, if I'm lucky. But and like we're talking about here, it's not only bucks though. I mean, it's like you just maybe curiosity. I don't know. I just find these things interesting. So it's like, man, even if I shoot a doe, it's like I want to know how old that deer is. It's just, I don't know. It's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's do this. I will send you guys. There's a 3 poster series. We have one on jawbone aging, one on aging bucks on the hoof. So it shows pictures of bucks in all of the different age classes that we talked about and the characteristics. Then we have another one on identifying antlerless deer in the field, which talks about the characteristics that we mentioned when we first started.
Mm-hmm.
The briefcase versus the suitcase, all that. So it's a 3 poster series for that. So how about I just send you guys that and you can take a look and let me know how good of a job that I did trying to explain it. Once you can see those posters.
We'll cross-reference the podcast to the posters. See how it went.
There you go. That sounds good.
We won't fight you on that.
Oh, absolutely.
And
Thank you.
My gut tells me is we'll look at those posters and go, yeah, by God, he was right.
That's right. Awesome.
But cool, Kip. We'll appreciate all the time and all the knowledge and experience and really, really, I keep saying it, but really interesting stuff. And
yeah,
looking forward to hopefully chatting with you guys in the future on other deer related topics.
That sounds great. I've enjoyed it, guys. So always my pleasure. I love to talk deer. So anything that I or we can do to help out, by all means, get a hold of us and let us know. We're glad to do it.
Awesome. And we know a lot of the listeners out there, of course, love talking deer and listening to things about deer. So be curious to know. Everybody in the comments below, if you're watching on YouTube, let us know, or comments on Instagram at Vortex Nation Podcast. Let us know if you've done deer aging, what the oldest deer maybe you've seen is. I mean, all that kind of thing. If you're going to do deer aging now. And yeah, all really cool stuff. Go check out NDA for sure. And otherwise, we'll see you on the next one.
I'll throw this out there, Jim. I'll make it even longer. But any other questions or things that you're curious about deer that you might want us to chat with NDA about?
That's right. Awesome. Well, thank you, everybody, for listening. We'll see you in a while. I don't know. Yep. Next time. Whatever.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
There you have it, folks. Thank you very much for listening. As usual, give this video a like if you liked it, comment something below, and give us a subscribe to the Vortex Nation podcast channel. It would mean a lot to us. Also, why don't you give us a follow over on Instagram while you're at it, at Vortex Nation Podcast. We'd love to hear from you over there, and we'll keep you updated with all kinds of cool photos and videos from our adventures that we do here. Otherwise, we will see you on the next one. Thank you again. Happy hunting and shooting, everybody. Have a good one.